All right, so week 12, here we go. We are going to go over water this week. So a couple of things we're going to look at. Number one, we'll look at dead zones and eutrophication. So eutrophication is just when there's excess nutrients in the water. So this happens often from agricultural runoff when you're using fertilizers on farms and you have a rain event that washes some of it away and gets into the local waterways. That's one cause of it. Another common cause is sort of downstream from sewer systems. And if any kind of, there are things in human waste that get into sewer systems that can cause eutrophication as well. So the problem is when you have too many of these nutrients in the water, they promote algae growth because algae, they're just plants, right? So, and the algae themselves, now there can be issues with algae. Like there's this annual thing down in Florida, if anybody's been down there, where they have these toxic algae. I think it's like a red algae. So they can be bad. There's some incidences with toxic algae in various water, like reservoir systems as well. But the dead zone problem, and a dead zone, by the way, is a lack of oxygen in the water. So anoxic condition, A-N-O-X-I-C, anoxic, meaning lack of oxygen. And so it happens when you have this eutrophication. You have all these excess nutrients which help facilitate algae growth. Now the problem is the algae die, they sink to the bottom, and the organisms that digest the algae, they take oxygen out of the water. So it's not the algae themselves, it's not the dead algae itself, it's when these organisms, these bacteria and so forth that metabolize the dead algae and they suck oxygen from the water. Okay, so that's a dead zone. It's a really big problem. There's this huge dead zone the size of New Jersey that forms every year outside of at the Mississippi River Delta, outside of their coast, coastal Louisiana, which is really bad for things that dwell on the bottom, like what's Louisiana known for? Shrimp. So where do shrimp live? The bottom. They're bottom feeders, and so it's a really big problem. Clams, mussels, and so forth. There's a problem in Chesapeake Bay. That's one of the things that helped kill the historical clam population there. So it's a big deal all over the world. This happens, you name it, you name the country and the continent, and there's certainly in every continent except for Antarctica, but a lot of countries have this problem. So this is a huge problem, and it's all caused by humans. Then we'll look at some issues with privatization. So privatization is actually a big sustainability topic. Privatization is just when you take a public good and privatize it. And so public good is anything that's owned publicly. So you think of everything from your local park to a national park to the ocean, certain lakes, certain land, right? So there's public goods. And if you privatize them, that means that you have then a private owner, an individual owner, which could be a corporate owner or an individual person. Okay, so that's privatization. This is happening all over the world. With various resources. And so we just go over a couple of examples. In South Africa, when the water supplies are privatized, in Atlanta, they experimented with privatizing the water supply. And so, it's not all bad. Privatization, when a private owner owns a resource, there's an incentive for them to manage it efficiently. Because they're usually trying to make money off of it if they've purchased it. And so, there's usually some efficiency improvements, whereas with the public good, you can kind of get that tragedy of the commons situation where nobody really owns it and I benefit, I stand to benefit more than I stand to lose by overusing that resource. So that can be a problem. And so when you privatize, you tend to, you can prevent that from happening, but tends to be a lot of negative consequences. Usually this resource gets more expensive, it becomes less accessible to people without resources. Sometimes it's just sort of like where you're standing in society is in terms of your access to that resource. So pretty much every time something's privatized, it becomes more expensive and people lose access to it. So we'll also go over this sort of infamous example in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where they privatized the water supply and ended up with these huge protests and so forth because people were having to choose between like water and feeding their families, water and paying rent. People were losing their houses because of water bills, and there was a lot of protests and so forth that unfortunately ended up in the death of a young man. And that was kind of like a seminal event. So and so this is a really tough issue, and I really want you to think about that as you go through the content. Privatization has its pros and cons. A public good, it tends to be, there's a propensity to have some mismanagement for public goods, and you have, of course, the tragedy of the commons issue as well. So privatization can get, sort of prevent some of that from happening, but it becomes more expensive and less accessible. So it's one of those things where there's usually not a clear-cut answer. So I really want you to think about the pros and cons of privatization and what it means for sustainability from all the 3E perspective. And then we'll look at a little bit, just one article about the relationship between fracking and water. This is, by the way, a pretty big issue out in Colorado, as I mentioned, because there is fracking out there and it's a semi-arid environment, as we learned in our last meeting. Water is a really, really big issue out there, and there's not a lot of it. People really know a lot about it. It's a really big topic, and so once fracking came into the picture in the mid I guess you'd call them the aughts, right? So like the 2005, 2006 range, it really got big, and it uses millions of gallons per well, and so that's a lot. You can supply thousands of households with the water that they use. So, and also there's a big issue, as you're reading the article, between like, do we, farming uses water for irrigation, but if I own my water rights, per Mark's presentation last week, if I have the water rights, I can sell it. I can sell it to whomever I want. And so if a fracking company is offering me 4 times or 10 times as much as the local farm, well, from an economic perspective, that's the right choice. But then, farming is a big industry out there. A lot of farming families, and it's a big part of the Colorado culture. So it's really become a really big issue. So that's something to pay attention to when we're out there. And I'd like to see if there's, maybe in our sustainability coffee shop discussion board, if you find anything about current issues with fracking and water out in Colorado, I'd like to see it. And finally, we'll end with ocean acidification, which is something that not a lot of people know about, I would say. It's not as big, obviously, as climate change, but perhaps it should be, because it's a really important issue, and it's really closely related to climate change. Some people call it climate change's evil twin, because they go hand in hand. Basically, when you have excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as it turns out, the ocean absorbs a lot of it, if not most of it. The problem is that CO2 is acidic, so carbonic acid, when it's absorbed into the water, and then so it changes the pH, which some animals, particularly ones that have shells, like calcium-based shells, they're really sensitive to pH changes. And so acidification, it sounds really dramatic. It's not like the ocean is like acid, like you dip your hand in it, it's going to burn your finger. But it is acidic in that it has a lower pH than neutral, right? So it's lower than, 7? And so that's a problem, because it's also a problem for coral reefs, which are one of the big organisms that build these calcium-based shells, or not shells, but calcium-based structures. And so, it's bad enough that coral reefs for themselves, but coral reefs support a huge amount of the fish and other marine life that humans depend on. So it's a really important biodiversity question. or a problem when you excuse me, coral reef bleaching events. And so that's something that hopefully after this lesson you'll really have on your radar, because it is potentially really devastating if we don't solve this problem of acidification. Okay, so that is an overview of the water lesson, a lot of really important topics. Yeah, I hope you enjoy the content, and if you have any questions, let me know.